Okay, so I've got the recorder going. Okay, Steven, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to have something to do.
It is, yeah. And before we get started, it's worth mentioning that we kind of have this interesting connection because you're on staff doing some really important investigative work for Nashville Scene, and I freelance for the Nashville Scene, but we've never met. Well, I mean, we kind of
Right.
chatted obviously before we started recording, but we haven't met yet. So
Yes. This is an experience I've had a lot now this year, is meeting people for the first time over video chat. So I'm getting kind of used to it.
yeah, it's I don't necessarily mind it because, as you know, like writing is often, especially when you're working from home, writing can be a really lonely sort of pursuit. We're just kind of like in our houses doing, I mean, unless you're doing like, on the street reporting and sort of
Yeah.
communities, but we're home a lot.
Yeah. And I'm a big talker, as my coworkers would to their chagrin. So I miss being in the newsroom and like walking around and talking to people. It's funny, when before all this, I used to, like, if I had a lot of work to do or something, I'd work from home because I knew I could just sort of lock in and do it. And now it's the opposite. Now I will sometimes go into our office, which is empty at this, it's like there's two people there, so it's fine. If I need to go in, I can go in. And so it's totally flipped. Now I have to leave the house if I have a lot to do, because I just lose my mind here, and we're all kind of on top of each other. So
Yeah,
it's been a weird one.
my sort of escape is Ugly Mugs because that's one of the only places that's like open for indoor seating.
Yeah.
Places you go, you get your coffee, and then you have to leave. So I wind up at Ugly Mugs a lot when I do need to get out of the house. But I don't know, our cases are on the rise, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit because we're going to talk about your coverage of COVID in jails in Tennessee. So we might touch on that. But first, I wanted to ask you where you're from, because obviously we both write for Nashville Scene, and like I'm from Tennessee, so I wasn't sure if you were as well.
Yeah, I'm not. I grew up in Florida, on the east coast of Florida, a little town called Indialantic, Melbourne area. And so I grew up there. I went to school in Alabama at Auburn University.
Okay,
and then that's where I met my now wife, and we moved up here after we graduated. So I've been here 10 years now, I guess, in Nashville, and writing for the Scene almost that long in some way. I freelanced for a couple of years before I got on staff. So that's the quick version. Yeah. So I slowly made my way up here.
So from Florida man to Tennessee man.
Yeah. I now it's funny, it's a little funny to be doing this work here, being from Florida, because Florida is just this never-ending supply of stuff to write about, particularly if you write about like anything related to sort of interesting crime or criminal justice or anything like that. But not that there's a shortage of those stories anywhere. But yeah, it's a target-rich environment down there for sure.
Sure. So it's funny that you went to Auburn. I didn't go to Auburn, but I did go to UNA. So the first 2 years of college, I went to the University of North Alabama. So kind of not super next.
Yeah.
Super next, but,
Yeah. No, and I spent a good bit of time in North Alabama. My wife's family's down there, so we're in that area all the time.
Got it.
Florence is a good town.
Florence is a good town. When I left, it was really, I think, starting to not boom, but like grow a little bit. And
it's grown, yeah.
I've heard that it continues to grow. So I haven't gone back, but I need to at some point. I used to sell my EP at the coffee shop there in town. So maybe I'll stop by and see you.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. Anyway, but did you major in journalism in college?
I did not. I majored in English.
Okay.
Which is close in some ways, I guess. I was one of those people who all through college, I just said that when people, I majored in English, but I didn't want to teach, which is one of the things that in college, everyone was like, oh, do you think you'll want to be a teacher or something? I didn't want to teach. I just told everyone I wanted to write. And then when I was in college, everyone reacted like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say, nodded their head like, oh yeah, well, of course, that's great, and I didn't really think much about the fact that I'd have to somehow make money doing that. In college, I was taking these fiction writing classes, and it's, you kind of imagine just getting out of school and just going to coffee shops and writing and stuff. And that's actually kind of how I ended up getting into journalism, because freelance reporting is the way that you can write and do that kind of work and get paid for it, So it was sort of, it was the way to do that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what that journey looked like, because I had the great fortune of majoring in journalism. And so I talk about this a lot, but even when I was in journalism school, like, we didn't talk about freelancing. We didn't talk about really how to get a job. I mean, we talked a lot
Mm-hmm.
about the actual meat of reporting, but I can imagine that it would be, somewhat difficult for someone who hasn't majored in journalism, considering the holes in my own education, to kind of make that transition. Because I hear from writers all the time who are like, well, shit, I didn't major in journalism, so what do I do? So I'm just wondering what that journey was like.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I read a lot of journalism, and I grew up in a real sort of news junkie home. My dad used to work in journalism some, and then taught journalism, still does, at the high school I went to. And so it was like I was familiar with it in the sense of, this is a thing you can do in that sort of way, which helped in some ways. But I mean, as far as kind of getting into it, I came up here, so my wife and I were about to graduate. We were engaged. We knew we were gonna move up here, and my wife's a nurse, and so we came up here one weekend. Turned out to be the week after the flood in 2010. It was a terrible time to look for a place to live, but she had an interview at one of the hospitals, and it was sort of like I had a few hours to kind of like find a job. It was like, okay, well, look around while I'm doing this interview. And I actually showed up. I just sort of showed up at the Scene offices, the same office that we're in now in the Gulch, and kind of just sort of said, hey, I'm looking to talk to someone about some work, and I ended up meeting a couple editors. And the great thing, and this is still sort of true, it's less so now, maybe just because of, budgets are tight and stuff, but I mean, we still use a lot of freelancers, and especially a lot of regular ones who we come back to. And so the great thing about freelancing for me was it was a chance to just get a shot at something. And so I had a few clips. I had freelanced for a small weekly paper in Auburn, just like a few sort of stories I had done. So I at least had something that I could say, like, hey, I've done a little bit of this. And from the editor's point of view at that time, I guess for them it was sort of like, well, we'll find something for you to try, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I mean, so I got a couple of small assignments that way, and I really did just sort of learn. I don't have a great answer, because I did just kind of learn on the job. I mean, it was like, it was sort of, I had a lot of hard times then, because I would say yes to stuff, and I would go get off the phone and go, okay, now I have to figure out how to do this, So, but also the people, the editors and people I worked with were very helpful in the sense of saying, like, hey, talk to this person, let's figure this out. I mean, I was so young and so green at the time that it was probably obvious that I needed a little bit of help, and so I did get that. But I don't know if that's answering your question totally, but yeah, I mean, I just sort of stumbled my way through it. And then what I always found was that, the more that I did, the more I could do, and the more work I got too, because increasingly, I mean, as soon as you can become someone who an editor thinks like, oh, well, we should shoot this person an email and see if they can jump on this for us real quick. I mean, as I'm sure editors you're trying to get freelance work from, they're so busy, and they have a staff that's too small. Like, almost any editor that you're pitching, you can be sure their staff is too small. So they have work that they need done, probably, that they wish they could have someone do. And as soon as I got to the point where I had like a good enough relationship, and I had done enough stuff that if something came up that they needed done real quick, I could make their day easier. That was big, you know. Um, but yeah, it was. I mean, it was definitely a learning curve. I was real lucky at the time too because the city paper was still around. The city paper used to be a news weekly too here in Nashville, owned by the same company at the time as the Scene, but it was sort of more of just a straight newspaper as opposed to the alt weekly. So I got to do different types of stuff that way. You know, I was doing film reviews and sort of like culture stuff for the Scene sometimes, and some news stuff, and then I was doing straight news stories for the city paper. So I got a lot of practice on a lot of different stuff pretty quickly, which really helped. Probably a lot of the stuff, the experience that maybe I would have gotten going to journalism school or writing for the school paper, which I didn't do at Auburn for some reason. I don't really know. Looking back, it's weird that I didn't, but I didn't do that. But so I got that kind of experience that way.
It does make sense. And I just wanted to touch briefly when you mentioned 2010, because there are going to be people watching this who are not from Nashville or Tennessee and are not familiar. But 2010 flood, if you don't know, was a really horrible flood that started out at the Opry Mills Mall and quickly spread to several neighborhoods. And so a lot of I was in high school at that time and I was in Lawrenceburg. And so I didn't really have an idea of how bad it was until I moved here. And it was like still a topic of conversation,
Yeah.
a decade later. Well, now it is a decade later, but when I moved here in 2017, I didn't know that the neighborhood I was moving into was the first one underwater. So every year when it would be like, we were there for a couple of years in that house, and in the spring, we would always get real nervous because it would start raining. And there was one time
Yeah.
where the water level got super high at the river behind our house. And my neighbors were like, yeah, this is about how high it was in 2010. And I was like, oh shit. So we all,
Yeah. I mean, it was wild. I mean, one of the people who were around might remember, but one of the big sort of points of discussion around the flood in 2010 was that at least at first, it wasn't getting a lot of national news coverage, and people here felt like, why are we sort of getting ignored? I mean, myself, we were down in Auburn, and we decided to come up here, and we started calling people, see people that had a house for rent or an apartment or something, and we got some responses that really were like, have you not turned on the news? Like, we cannot show you a place right now. Like, it was, but we just sort of were clueless.
with scuba gear, sure.
Yeah, but people were just like, this is a weird time for you to be, so it was, it was a strange time. I mean, it was a little while until I lived here full time. So I kind of missed most of that, but the tail end of it right after it happened. And yeah, it's definitely continued to be a story in some ways because of either the after effects of it, or now we're getting to the point where it's like places that are in the floodplain, like, can people build there? What can be done with those areas to mitigate future flooding? There was a big debate about a flood wall downtown a few years ago. It's sort of a constant thing now.
And of course, then we had the horrible tornado. I shouldn't laugh about it. It's not funny. I mean, my apartment building got wrecked for all intents and purposes. So feels like we're always battling horrible weather events here, and it continues to make headlines and news. It's like a big part of our news cycle, I feel like.
Yeah, it's well, yeah, I mean, this year is a special one for that kind of stuff, for the disaster coverage. It's weird. I remember when the tornado in March, when that tornado happened, there are those things that happen where it seems like all of a sudden there's only one news story and it's this thing that has happened. And when you're working in news, those are really strange times, because like every story you do somehow is connected to that. And we did a whole issue about the tornado, and we were covering it. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is going to be what this year is about. Like, we were already talking about like, hey, the end of the year, we're going to have to plan some coverage of this, like looking back on this, which we've still done some of, but like then the pandemic really, it became clear that was going to be as big as it was. And it's just weird to think back on those few weeks before where it seemed like it was going to be a really different year. But
I remember it was like,
anyway,
it was in the next week that that we did the lockdown. And then like you were saying about that sort of retrospective coverage, I mean, I did that tree piece about how many trees had been taken by the tornado and how they were being replaced. And that was like in June or July. So I'm sure that we'll continue to have some of that retrospective type of coverage.
Mhm.
But I wanted to ask you how you went from basically getting on staff at the scene to sort of some of the really important things that you're covering now. So to touch on that, for people who haven't read your work yet, you've been covering a lot about, and I'm pulling up my notes on this just to make sure that I get in all the details. So I really wanted to ask about your coverage of COVID in jails and the Purvis Payne case. I'm curious how those stories came to be. Like, did you get the tips, or did your editors let you know, hey, these really horrible things in the criminal justice system are happening and you should cover them? And I also, again, for people who aren't familiar, we may want to mention a little bit about the Payne case, in that he's a Black man who's been on death row for decades and has always maintained his innocence and has been fighting to get DNA testing because there's DNA that has not yet been tested.
Mhm. Yeah, so when I first started out, I was doing a lot of politics coverage. I was doing a little bit of everything, but I was doing more and more politics coverage, partly because I did some kind of longer term freelance work at the legislature, and I learned a lot by doing that, and worked with people who helped teach me a lot. And so I was doing that, and the criminal justice stuff was things I was always interested in. I was always interested in the death penalty, and in 2014, when the state tried to schedule some executions, actually did schedule a few, I started covering a little bit of that, and then those executions all got called off. And so that as a topic sort of went dormant for a little bit, but that got me more and more into kind of covering that stuff regularly. I'm trying to think what it was exactly. There was just a few stories where I got in touch with, and I'm sure you've had this experience where you have a source on one story, and then over the course of talking to them for that story, they mention some other thing, and then it sends you off in that direction. I did this long story about a small town that was dealing with a landfill. It was like this company had put a landfill basically in the middle of the neighborhood, and it had all these horrible effects. And anyway, I was working on that story, and one of the attorneys on that story was working with another attorney on this criminal case that was really interesting, and kind of tipped me off to that. And so that I had a couple experiences like that where someone would just tell me about a really interesting case or something. And the lucky thing for me that in working at a place like the Scene is that we have the opportunity to do longer stories where we can, do a cover story that's more, you can go longer and get more in depth on things. And I always wanted to try to write longer stories. And so it's really fortunate to be able to have a place where you can learn how to do that, and so I started covering kind of that stuff. So I guess that to answer, you asked kind of like how these stories have come up. I mean, the biggest way is, for me, has always been that the more, like the best way for me to sort of come up with stories or find out about stories is to do them. And by which I mean, like, every time I do a story, I talk to a couple people who then are now people that I can call again and say, like, hey, are you working on anything else? Do you know about anything else that's going on that might be interesting? And so, or once you do I always try to tell people, like, if you want to cover whatever the topic is, if you find a way to write one story on that topic, people who care about that topic a lot of times reach out to you. And that's what's happened to me. I mean, after I wrote my first story about a woman who had been accused of child abuse, which was this complicated story, but she had been accused of abusing this child, had denied it, and appeared to have been sort of wrongly lumped in with this situation. I write this story, and then some other people they have a thing that comes up, and they think, well, I want to tell this person at the Scene who wrote this other story because they must write about this stuff. So you start hearing things from people, because, I mean, I would imagine you've had that experience. You can write one story about a topic, and people who care about that will start emailing you saying, hey, if you thought that was crazy, you should hear about this other thing. So you can go really deep down the rabbit hole that way. And that's kind of what has happened to me with the criminal justice stuff. the Purvis Payne case is actually a really interesting one for us to talk about, because the first story I wrote about that was a freelance story for The Appeal, which is a great website that covers criminal justice issues that people should check out.
So you
But
do freelance on top of writing for The Scene, correct?
some, yeah. I mean, not a lot, but I do some, yeah.
Because you have to, or want to, or both?
Because it depends. I mean, I like to, and also it's never bad to make some extra money, you know, but
may be a better fit for another publication.
Yeah, there are also sometimes where, yeah, there are stories. The Purvis Payne case is an interesting one because I've covered that for The Scene too, but a lot of times the stuff I'll do freelance is like a story that wouldn't necessarily make sense for The Scene, or it's a story that an editor has reached out to me about separately. And so I've done some stuff that way too. But yeah, the Purvis Payne case was one that I was familiar with just from knowing having covered other death row cases, and knowing his name and knowing a little bit about his case and knowing his attorneys and stuff. And then once he was scheduled for an execution, which originally he was scheduled to be executed on December 3rd, that's since been delayed. But I started looking into it, and for obvious reasons. I mean, his case stood out because of as you said, the Black man accused of murdering a white woman, and who has always maintained his innocence. And, you know, he has an intellectual disability. So it had a lot of
unfortunately,
the markers of, I'm sorry?
I said, unfortunately, it feels very familiar.
Yes, it had a lot of the markers of other cases that have been either wrongful convictions or that there have been a lot of questions about, at least. In this case, one of the biggest ones being that there was this DNA that had never been tested that they were trying to get tested. So, yeah, I wrote that first story about that, and that was going back to having relationships with editors. I mean, I've written a number of different stories for The Appeal at this point, and that was going back to, gosh, I'm trying to remember the first time. Probably it was 2017 or 2018, the first time I wrote a story for them. But, you know, that was just from, at some point I had just DM'd one of the editors there about kind of writing for them at some point. I think maybe he had followed me on Twitter, and so we DM'd each other. I'm pretty shameless when it comes to just messaging people. So like, if someone acknowledges my existence on the internet, I will just like shoot them a message and say, hey, you know, it's good to be connected. Like, let's whatever. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, oh, what can this person do for me? But it's good to know people and good to be connected. And I've learned a lot from people that way. And people have been very kind to me. And I hope that I'm kind to people who reach out to me that way. You know, it's like, so I've gotten to know some editors that way. And not that all of them have given me work, but it's been a good network to have and a good way to sort of learn of things or whatever else. So my relationship with the editor that I've worked with at The Appeal is a little bit like that. And so when a lot of the executions were starting to get scheduled in Tennessee, we had been talking, and I had already written about something else for them on the topic. And we started talking about the Purvis Payne case specifically because I think he had reached out to me and said, like, is there a specific case, you know, of this batch of new executions that we could kind of focus on? And we circled on that one because it seems like a uniquely problematic one. And then I've
national attention, correct? I mean, the Purvis Payne case has now been covered nationally, right?
Yeah. The Innocence Project picked it up, and which, you know, of course they can put a lot of power behind something, so that's a big deal. And then with them, the court ordering the DNA testing, which is in the process of happening now. I mean, we haven't found out any of the results of that yet, but there's and you know, there's sort of a unfortunate part about these cases, which is they tend to get a lot of coverage right before an execution. So his execution date was December 3rd. And so there was more and more coverage happening. And the court or the governor gave him a temporary reprieve, actually not because of any of the innocence questions, but because of COVID-19. But the effect will sort of be the same, which is that there will be enough time for the DNA testing to go through and some other things maybe to work themselves out. So we'll see. But yeah, that has gotten some more attention, which is great. And I've written some more about that for the scene. And then I want to make sure I answer you. Oh, you were asking about like COVID and prisons and stuff. By the time that all came, I was covering criminal justice more regularly, and so it sort of was just something that I knew I wanted to check into. And there's been a lot of great coverage about that nationally too, which has been helpful for me to try to figure out how I can put what's happening here in context. But that's another case where I had some sources from previous work that I knew I could go to and say, hey, can you help me get in touch with some people who have family in prison, or can you help me get a sense of what the situation's like out there, you know? And so that was one of those cases where those things just sort of build on themselves. Because now that I've done a few of the other stories, I know these people and they know they can call me with something, or I know I can call them and ask them, you know, just any question about what's going on, and they can kind of help point me in the right direction.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess as you talk to those sources, you realized, hey, the situation was probably worse than maybe you had realized. I want to ask about the awards that you won, and I hope that doesn't embarrass you. But the reason I want to ask is because I think a lot of freelancers kind of feel not, I don't want to say left out, but we're often, or what I hear from a lot of writers is that we just don't know how to promote ourselves. A lot of us don't even know that there are awards available. Conversely, I do have a friend who's like self-submitting for the Pulitzer, and I was like, hell yeah, baby, like you should absolutely do that. So there's kind of this spectrum, but I think most freelance writers are probably like, awards, those exist. So I wanted to ask you about the award that you won and how, like, did you submit that, or did the staff of the Nashville Scene submit that? Because it was an alt weekly award, right?
Yeah, the Ann Awards are from the Association of, I'm going to get the name wrong, Association of Alternative Newspapers, I think is now. It's the sort of alt weekly association for papers like The Scene all around the country. So those awards, we just, as a paper, we submit a bunch of stuff every year, and you know, it obviously felt good to win one of those this year. But I always feel like my position on journalism awards is that there are far too many of them, except that I would also like to win them too. So but yeah, that one we just you know, every year around whenever they have a call for submissions, and so at the paper, our editors and everyone at the paper kind of will submit things, and we submit, you know, we submit freelance stuff for that too, in various things. I mean, we've had one of our freelance illustrators has won a couple times for doing work like that, so it just sort of depends, you know.
Do you find that award winning helps your career or not? Like, did you find like, oh, now I'm suddenly in hot demand? And I ask that because I don't, again, I guess I'm just trying to kind of suss out if freelancers should be submitting themselves for awards that they're qualified for, or kind of if you think we should just do the work and not focus on.
I mean, it definitely feels good, you know. I mean, I don't get me wrong, I'm an attention whore, so I like that. That was great.
Attention whore, we all are.
Right? Yeah. I mean, so I'm not trying to be above that at all. But I think anyone who does something they're proud of should submit it for recognition. I mean, by all means, if you want to. As far as like helping your career, I mean, I'm sure it doesn't hurt when you're like, if you go on to apply for something or whatever, if you can list that, if anything, because it's sort of a stand-in for experience. Like, it shows that you've done things that have been, you know, recognized or so yeah, I would imagine it can't hurt. I mean, no one's beating down my door about it, but you know, I'll definitely mention it when I need to on things, you know, so I'm sure it can't hurt. there are all sorts of, I always feel a little uncomfortable about that stuff just because, I'm proud of my work, but the awards are also can be arbitrary in a sense of who gets submitted for them. And we all know there are problems with who gets on staff at newspapers. And, I don't know the demographics of people who won awards, these AN awards this year. I haven't looked, but, the alt weekly world is a very white world. And so I would imagine that's reflected in the awards. So, it's not like they're a perfect barometer of journalism talent or anything, but yeah, by all means, I think if you do freelance work that you're able to submit for more people to recognize, it can't hurt you get, it can't hurt, I would think. But I also just think that probably by the time you've done something that you would submit for an award, you've probably made an impression on the editors you're doing that work for anyway. So that's probably, in terms of like your day-to-day, week-to-week work, I would think that probably makes just as much difference as someone giving you an award for it, because the people who really are assigning you the work and who are thinking in those moments when they need to fill a hole in the magazine or the paper, like, who can I call? You've probably already proven you're that person at that point. So
what you were saying a second ago, though, about how white alt weeklies can be, that was a good segue into my next question, which was like, we're both white writers, unless I'm making a gross assumption.
No, you're not. You're not. Yes.
So something that I think about a lot, and so I did a piece for Cosmo recently about, I don't think I signed an NDA with them. So Cosmo, if you end up watching this, please don't be angry at me saying this. But I had to sign an agreement to use at least 50% BIPOC sources. And that was the first agreement that I had ever signed like that. And at first I was a little worried because I wanted to make sure that I was doing the story justice and hitting those benchmarks. And so I mean, it's a very vulnerable thing to talk about. Like, I know that as a white writer, I'm not perfect. So the reason I bring that up is because I wanted to ask you what advice you have for white writers who are covering like criminal justice or death row issues, which of course predominantly affect marginalized communities like Black people. So how are some of, or what are some of the ways when you go into these really sensitive and vulnerable kind of stories that are very important, that you would, maybe recommend for white writers, things to keep in mind, or how can we do a better job?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's a very, I'm trying to think. I think the first thing I would probably say is being willing to ask that question and not treading lightly, knowing that you are coming to a sensitive topic without the experience that the people in it have, if that makes sense. So like, I think even just the awareness of that helps a little, because hopefully it makes you more careful or more cognizant of it. Speaking about making sure that you're using diverse sources, that's really interesting. We've been having that conversation a lot at the scene of trying to keep better track of who we're quoting in the paper, who we're photographing, who we're putting on the cut, all these kinds of things. And I think that, just on sort of a blunt surface level, like, I have tried to think more about, if I'm writing about a topic or a story that affects this group of people, trying to make sure that you quote those people. And that can seem obvious, but it's very easy not to do. Like, you can write a story about systemic racism in criminal justice system, and it seems obvious to say, well, I'm saying this, and I could easily go grab stories of mine where I haven't done this. So I'm sure I'm guilty of it. But I think, yeah, just making sure that those voices are actually in the story. This is different than the like racial demographic part of it, but it's similar in that, like, one thing I've tried more and more to do, however I can, in writing about prisons, for instance, is to either quote prisoners if I can, try to get in touch with people by mail, or because that's a population that is often written about but not necessarily, their voices don't necessarily get to be in the story. And I think that same kind of thing applies to if you're, I wrote a few years ago, I wrote a long story about North Nashville and the sort of historic change that's gone on there. And it was really important. I felt just like you said, like a vulnerable spot. I was like, on the one hand, your job as a reporter is to tell stories that aren't your own story. So it's fine, I think, to go and say, this story is nothing like my life, but I'm going to tell it. But you definitely, like you're saying, you definitely do have to be aware of that and make sure that the people you're putting in the story can actually tell it. And so it was really important to make sure, like, I'm quoting people who have lived in this neighborhood for a long time, who have had this experience and who can speak to it personally, so that I'm not just crafting a story that leaves those people out. I hope I'm answering your question. I mean, I guess the best answer I have for it is just to be very aware of it and think of it and ask yourself that all the way through, because I know the pressure that can happen when you get towards the end of a story and you might have this creeping feeling in the back of your mind, like, oh, should I make that last phone call? Or like, did I talk to enough women in this story if it's about a certain topic? Or have I only talked to white people? And again, those might seem like obvious questions, but I know the pressure that you can feel to go, well, I've got what I need to do this story, And for me, I find that that's the hard hurdle, because we all have our like network that where you're working on a story and you go, I know 3 people I can call today for this story. But if you're white, there's a chance all those people might also be white. And so it's very easy to produce a story then that only has white people in it. And so, I think just always making that extra phone call and always being aware of it. I feel like I'm just saying obvious stuff, but if it was easy to do, we wouldn't have this problem. So like a lot of us are bad at it.
You know what I mean? Like it probably feels obvious to us, because hopefully we're like decent white people, but not every white reporter is, unfortunately. So I think even if we don't have all the answers, I do think it's important just to have these conversations. And I put this on the list of questions because it is something that you cover definitely more than I. But like, I'm about to jump into a story about Haynes Park. So there was my cat, as soon as I said Haynes Park, he was like, that's appalling me. But anyway, at the Metro City Council meeting a couple weeks ago, there was a neighborhood advocate there who was like, hey, we're having issues in the neighborhood and no one's paying attention and we need some help. And of course, it is a predominantly Black neighborhood. So I've tried to think about, making sure that I'm not going in with like a white savior complex. And it can be difficult, but I don't know if the vulnerability of it is enough to stop me from covering stories that I think need to be covered, like people.
Yeah, I think it's a tough balance, I mean, I do think there are some stories that well, how do I say this? I mean, I guess here's the way I would put it. As a reporter, yes, there's a way in which I'm telling the story because I'm the one writing it. But the people you quote in the story or the people you talk to for the story are really the ones telling it. They're the ones giving the information. So to me, if I'm going into a situation like that, I guess my biggest fear as a reporter is writing a story and it coming out and the thought of the people in that world, whether it's I've written a story about a Black neighborhood or I've written a story about a criminal case. I want the people in that world to read it and go, yeah, I recognize this. My biggest fear is someone reading it and going, did they talk to anyone? Like, did they even come to my neighborhood? So like that fear is usually what drives me to go, I have to go like knock on some doors. Like, I'm so worried about getting this wrong that, I wish I could say that it were totally just righteousness that makes me want to include diverse sources in my stories, but it's also just, you will look like an idiot if you write about a neighborhood and you didn't talk to enough people in the neighborhood to even get the actual situation right. Like, you will just look dumb. So that in itself is like enough of a reason to make you go, well, I'm not really going to know what's And we've had, I've had that experience before where like sometimes you can have the best intentions. Like say you go knock on I've done some stories where I've literally just knocked on doors and see if people will talk to me. Sometimes you could do that all day, and just by chance, like you end up getting quotes from 3 white people. So you go, okay, well, it's not like I went seeking out white people, but I think, this is just that it goes back to that other thing of making that extra phone call, right? Like just always remembering that I'm not telling the full story if this story doesn't have a diverse group of sources and people in it, then I'm not telling the full story. And if we saw that more as a journalism failure than we tend to, maybe that would fix it. I mean, it's also a problem of having staffs that are too white, and I include the scene in that. Our staff is overwhelmingly white. And so you have a bunch of white people, even with the best intentions, sitting around discussing stories, you're going to be missing things. And that's a thing we got to fix.
It's true. There was something in there that what did you say? That brought up a really good point. The more I think
it's my fault for rambling.
No, the more I think about it, the more I forget. Do you ever do that? You forget it, but then the more you try to remember it, the worse that it gets. But there was, I don't remember what you said.
So, don't mind me. I'm gonna move here and plug in.
What do you think? What do you think? I mean, while we're talking, my cat is like falling off the couch and going like very Simba, very Lion King. So anyway, yeah, I'm glad that we got to talk a little bit about that. And I don't remember. And clearly, it must not have been a super intelligent thought because I can't hang on to it. So I'm going to let it go. So I wanted to move on and ask you about your book, because you have an upcoming book, and I know a lot of writers, a lot of journalists, at least, we have that path of like moving from stories and covering sort of a particular subject area. Here he goes again. The problem is he keeps going back and forth. He can't decide where he wants to be. And then in the midst of all that, he's really old and he only has 3 legs. So then he just kind of like,
not bothering me.
The other night I had a package of salami, and he was so hot after the salami that he got stuck in between. Like his body was wedged between the bed and the table. And I was like, dude, I mean, he couldn't. Anyway, so yeah, so I wanted to ask about your upcoming book and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're covering and how you got representation. I mean, obviously the relevant thing for the rest of the writers who may be watching is how they might be able to get representation too, or kind of how that happens.
Yeah. So my book is about, it's weird talking about it in the present tense because I'm still working on it, but it will be about, or is about, a community of death row prisoners and the people who visit them. So there's a serious community of folks who visit death row regularly. Not family members, not partners or spouses or anything, but just people who for various reasons have ended up becoming regular visitors at death row. And it's a whole world that I didn't know existed until kind of the end of 2018 when these executions started up. And I started meeting people who went out there and kind of just fell into this whole community that existed.
Is it a religion? Like, are they trying to, is it spiritual?
A number of them have gotten into prison visitation through church, but it's not like this. It's not like a church ministry or something. Like they're all sort of, some of them are connected and some of them aren't. A number of them, I think, did start visiting the prison through like someone at a church saying like, hey, you can visit prisoners or something like that. But yeah, it's not, when I say a community, it's not like they've become a community because they all visit the prison on Monday nights and see each other every week and get to know, have gotten to know each other. And so over a period of time, I got to go out there and have gotten to know a lot of the folks out there. And, I was getting to know this community as these executions were happening. And so, like a lot of people who do this kind of work, I'm sure I've always thought I wanted to write a book. And this is the first thing I came upon where I was like, oh, this is a book's worth of stuff here. A lot of times you have an idea, and at the beginning you're like, man, I could write about this forever. But then you write the story and you're like, no, I think that's pretty much it. I think I'm done with that. But this was different. So yeah, that's kind of what it's about. It's about this community of folks sort of living through this execution spree of the past few years, and these death row prisoners, these men on death row, who a lot of people might imagine as these Hannibal Lecter figures, who actually, before COVID anyway, every week a lot of them would come out to this visitation room and sit down in a room full of people and hang out and talk for a couple hours. And it's just such a different environment than I would have ever imagined, than I think a lot of people imagine. So that's kind of what it's about. You asked about representation. My agent, Lauren McLeod, is actually an example of, when I said earlier that I am sort of shameless about DMing people. A couple of years ago, we had been following each other on Twitter. She's based here in Nashville, so and I just messaged her out of the blue and was like, good to be connected on here. Like, let's get a cup of coffee or something. So we got a cup of coffee and just talked generally. This is long before I pitched the book idea or had any, and so we just sort of got to know each other. It was not like about anything. We just sort of talked. I'm interested in the book world anyway. She's, it's an interesting industry if you do this kind of work. And so we had kind of gotten to know each other that way. And it was like, yeah, well, sometime down the road, if you have an idea for a book, let me know. Let's talk about it. And then when this idea came up, I sort of joke, but it's the truth. I pitched it to my wife, I pitched it to an old editor of mine, and then I pitched it to Lauren, my agent, who liked it and signed me. And so then speaking of pitching and freelancing, we embarked on that whole process of trying to pitch it to publishers and stuff. But yeah, that's sort of I hope that all is clear enough. But yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I was making a joke. So the first step writers need to take is finding, it's not really a joke, find a local literary agent on Twitter and follow them and maybe ask them for a cup of coffee if it's safe.
I mean, honestly, like, all the work I've gotten in my life is from just like hitting people up. I have the job I have now at the Scene because I just used to show up at the Scene offices a lot and talk to people. And, sort of, I was just around a lot and I talked to people a lot. And it was, I don't know how they felt about it, but I kept getting work and I was just around, and the freelance work I've got has a lot of times been from just either cold emailing people, sometimes with a pitch, but also just like, hey, just I'm around, if you want to talk about something. And then, that's my relationship with my agent was a similar thing, in that, it's not like there are plenty of, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people I have emailed who have not emailed me back, or who I have emailed and we've been like, yeah, it's good to be connected. And then that's it. And that's fine. But I guess I just always, it's weird because in a lot of areas in my life, I have like this sort of fear of rejection that everyone would have. But for whatever reason, I think it's mostly that if you're online, if you're on Twitter or whatever, and someone follows you, like, they've shown an interest in you to some degree. So why not say, hey, and, I guess that's how I'd put it. If you're a freelance writer, you're on Twitter and an editor somewhere follows you, like, they've acknowledged your existence. They're showing interest in your work to some degree. And so I don't, by all means, like, hit them up and just start a conversation with them. I think in my experience, I've always been pleasantly surprised at how willing people are to, if it is someone local, get a cup of coffee or talk, or if it's not someone local, how much I get a response that's like, perfectly nice and open to the possibility of working together. So I think, I don't want to make it sound like that always works, but people are more open to it than I sometimes think you assume if you're worried about, reaching out.
It's interesting because I think we have that in common. I never know how to describe it, but I do have a really terrible fear of rejection, mostly because I actually feel like a genuine social reject. And so I often really struggle in like social situations, but at the same time, I am kind of relentless, like I'm showing up in people's DMs, or I'm pitching. I have a lot of writers that say to me, "Well, I want to pitch X publication, but I'm not big enough." And I'm like, "Who the fuck cares? Like, send them an email and see if they want your story." And maybe that is not always the best attitude to have, but it was funny because when I DM'd you on Twitter, I was like, "Man, I don't know. He just won this award and he's doing some really good work, and I don't know if he's gonna want to talk to me for this little project." But it's such a good example of that, like, not that there's like a terrible power dynamic, but I just mean it's a good example of just kind of, shooting your shot in a way, and saying, "Hey, I would really love to connect and have a conversation," and then people are more open to it than you think, like you said.
Yeah, well, it's very nice of you to say all that, but yeah, no, I'm just another jerk on Twitter, so it doesn't. But I think that is instructive. Like that's how a lot of people feel. Like even the people who are editors at the publication you want to write for, they're spending a lot of time online. Yeah, they're busy. Like your idea might not be right for them. It's not that they'll say yes all the time, but like they're probably not going to blow you off necessarily. Like they're looking for writers, and especially for editors. I mean, they're looking for new writers. Like a lot of those people are actively want to be finding new people that they can use. And so again, like to me, if someone, I'm not just like in someone's mentions who doesn't follow me being like, "Hi, like notice me." But if someone follows me, if it's like, I'm gonna you probably be like, okay, like if someone follows me and I follow them and I know their work, I'm gonna like shoot them a message and be like, "Hey, I really like your work. It's good to be connected." Like to me, that's the equivalent of like if I'm in a coffee shop and someone comes up and says hi to me, like I'm going to talk to them. Like if so yeah, I would just encourage people to do that. And I hope at least, I mean, I'm sure there are jerks out there. And there are emails that I have neglected responding to. So it's, it happens, but I think my experience has been really great. And I mean, this gets back to what we were talking about before about our networks, and we've all got people in our industry have to do a better job of expanding those networks so that people who aren't white can have the experience I'm describing, where they reach out to someone and they get a really positive response and they get sort of brought into a network of people. Like, so I don't want to be, I'm aware that not everyone has that experience, and more people need to. I mean, that avenue needs to be open to more people, and that definitely involves people like me and people like our editors at the Scene and editors at other publications, like proactively reaching out to people to diversify their freelance pools and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I would also say, like, if you're a freelancer, white or non-white, I mean, people are looking for writers. Like the budgets are tight and they may not have the money or space for it right now, but like they want to know of writers that they don't know of, because that's what they need. Like I know my editor, our editors at the Scene, they would be happy for me to say this, like they need people to write stuff. So like they're not going to be mad about knowing that you exist, and knowing that you're someone they might be able to work with. So
Yeah, I mean, they gave me some work this morning, and I didn't pitch that, so that tells me like, hey, there's stories out there that need to be covered. And it's funny because before, like the last year, I mean, obviously I quit my job a year ago. I was part-time freelance before that, but what was I going to say? Oh, after I quit my job, I quickly realized that I can't be. I never really understood the concept of like networking and the importance of it, and I was very much like, I don't need anyone. I can do everything all by myself. I'm the only one I need, like, and I appreciate that mentality about myself in a lot of ways because it's gotten me this far. But also, like I said, in the last year, I've just really learned that like networking is really important, and reaching out to people, again, like you said, not to ask how they can help you, but just to actually connect and have conversations that later on could, lead to a collaboration of any kind, whether it's literary representation, source, story idea, tip, whatever.
yeah,
And that wasn't
well, it's
always
also just
a priority for me.
Yeah, it's also just encouraging. I mean, if you write, we were talking earlier about how it can be kind of a lonely pursuit, or it's something you do in isolation. And I mean, obviously, if you're on staff somewhere, you do get to have that experience of like having coworkers before COVID, at least, you're in an office with people. And I love that. I love being around other people. But especially if you're a freelancer, I mean, building out the sort of community of people that that are also writers, that also do this stuff, or that are also, it's just encouraging to be like, oh yeah, other people are trying to do this. Other people think that what I'm doing is worthwhile. Like, you need all that stuff just to keep going. So I think it's worth it just for that, even if you never get any work out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, most of the Bitchin writers interviews I've done have been friends, like people that I met on Twitter, like Lola and Caitlin are great examples. They're writers that I met on Twitter, and then we became close enough, and I was familiar enough with their work that I said, hey, do you want to like sit down and talk about this? Because um listen, I think one thing I wanted to do with this series is I love long form, the podcast. Don't get me wrong.
Mm.
I love long form. But I find that a lot of those writers that they interview, they just have such a different background of experience that may not be available to freelancers. Or as you know, if you were looking for jobs in 2010, like journalism has changed so
Oh
much.
yeah.
So it's like the way that we get here is so different, and I'm trying to talk about that. And also at the same time, I'm learning too. Like I have been writing for a very long time, because I needed the income, but now it's my full-time job, and there's so many things that I didn't know, like networking. So I've had to really learn how to shift my priorities in the last year.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure, as you've realized, and I've read some of the stuff you've written about, like this pitching and stuff, and it's definitely a different business doing it locally versus pitching for national. It's a whole different thing. Like a publication like The Scene, we're coming out weekly and we're focusing on local stuff. If you're a local writer, you can, and you do good work and have like the good ideas, and you're reliable, like you can get a lot of regular work, because every week we got to put out another paper, we put stuff online, like, and there's a lot of stories going on in the city that we can't cover them all. So like, if you can get plugged into a thing like that, you can do a lot of regular stuff. Whereas the national publications, it's just a different thing, because you got to figure out how you can plug in there, like what they need, what they want, what they're looking for. And it's just a different sort of animal, it seems like. But yeah, I feel very lucky to have gotten into it when I did, because not that there was a ton, it was already sort of after the boom, the alt, like, it's funny to think about, but like alt weeklies used to be this like kind of a big business, like, and then, once classifieds went away, that sort of stopped, and they're still around, but they don't have the huge budgets that they used to have. But I feel really lucky to have gotten into it at a time when I could just show up and say like, hey, can I write? And they were like, yeah, you can give it a shot. Like, we can find something for you to do. Whereas even now, like, budgets are just a little tighter with freelance, and with going, okay, can we afford to hire this person to do this thing? Or should we try to get someone on staff to do it? Or, that those questions are a little trickier. So it is a little harder to do, even how I ended up getting into this. It's a little harder to do it now, for sure. If I were just like getting out of school now and trying to get into this work, I don't know, that would be difficult. But especially now, I mean, I feel for people trying to break into journalism now, because you can't, it's so much, I feel like so much harder if you can't go meet with someone in person, can't go, like, I don't know, I'm always so bad at like just emailing someone. Like, I always just feel like if I could sit down with you and pitch you an idea, I bet I could convince you. Like, I bet I could, but it's probably a bad thing for a writer to say, because I should be able to write some great email that would convince someone. But like, I just always feel a little better if I can have a relationship with someone and sort of develop that trust that way, as opposed to just, my email is going to be so great, my pitch is going to be so amazing that you'll just, trust me with it. And without being able to do that as much almost this past year, I feel like that's really difficult.
It is really difficult. When you're talking to someone, there's context clues. It's like things get lost in translation via text and email. I think it does so much to dull your sense of personality, you know, because you can't, there's no emotion. And if you do use a smiley face, like they'll think that you're unprofessional. So it is what it is. But that also is a good segue to my last two questions, because I wanted to ask about freelancers like myself who want to do investigative work. And I'm asking this a bit out of selfishness because this is something that I've been trying to do. I would characterize a lot of the early for like early bylines that I did even before I was full-time freelance. Some of it was like fluffy. I mean, there was still meat there. The stuff I was doing for MTV, like I was writing about TikTok trends, and a lot of that like talked about problematic behaviors or uh-oh, now there's two of you. Hello.
Hey, I lost you. I'm sorry.
I was just talking away. I'm sorry about that.
I don't know what happened over here.
I was just saying that the conversation we were having was a really good segue into my final two questions.
Oh yeah.
Now he's back there. Goodness. Anyway, so hey, no, you cannot eat the bamboo, sir. We have some attitude adjustments we're working on. Anyway, so but the thing is, as annoying as he is right now, if I put him in the bedroom and close the door, he would just cry extremely loudly. And that would be even worse because then you'd be wondering if I was like murdering him or something. So there's no, in a 600 square foot apartment, there's just no way for me to like not have him be irritating in some fashion. Anyway, so yeah, I wanted to ask about what freelancers like me, and I'm asking this a little bit out of selfishness, can do if we want to cover more investigative type of pieces. I've done a couple investigations. The first one was for a zoo, which was it's a terrible zoo. Do not go to that zoo if you. For those of you who may be watching, I don't want to say the name because those people are highly aggressive and will like sue me for libel or whatever. But anyway, so but I'm wondering, you know, if you heard from a freelancer like me who was like, hey, I've covered a lot of digital culture and fluff in the past, but I want to do some really deeper investigative work, what would be your advice to them?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like I'm always learning a lot about this too, so I don't want to claim expertise, but the first thing I would say is just to read a lot of the kind of stuff you want to do. I've learned so much about how to do this job by reading the kind of people who do the kind of work I want to do. I feel like that may be sort of a disappointingly obvious sounding thing, but it just like, and I guess what I mean by that is, even if you don't, like if I read some investigative piece, for one thing, the great thing about journalism and learning how to do different kinds of journalism by reading is that a lot of journalism shows its work. So if you read an investigative piece, a lot of times they'll say, we obtained these documents this way, like this is how we got this. You know, I mean, they won't tell you everything, but like, and then you either learn like, oh, like I can file a records request for that stuff. Or you learn, you now have a question that you can ask, like, hey, what does this mean? Like it's a great way to just figure out how that kind of work looks and how it's approached. I mean, that's still the thing I do, is just like try to read those things when they come out and really go like, how could I do this? Like, how could I try to do this? I do think it probably is more difficult for freelancers just because that kind of work is hard to do when you have to, one, it can take longer. And I know if you're relying on freelance for your whole income, like you can't be taking 6 months on one story. You got to be kicking stuff out, you know, more regularly. So that's hard. And obviously, like if you're people who are on staff places have the editing help and sometimes the legal help that you need to do that kind of work. So it's definitely more challenging for freelancers. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the big thing I would say, is like just to try to really digest that kind of work. And that's also how I feel like I end up getting a lot of ideas for things, is saying like, oh, I read this investigation of this, and it may be on a total different topic, but it will trigger a thought of things you could look into that you do have access to. And but the other, in a way, I say all that, but the other great thing about, I feel like there are definitely like techniques and skills you learn about investigative journalism, whether that's just like learning how to do better with records requests. Like I've been spending a lot of time recently trying to beef up on like kind of being better at that, trying to file more records requests, but also sort of know more precisely how to do it well and how to narrow what you're looking for. And there are, so I've been trying to learn more about that. But the great thing about it also is, on a basic level, it's also just following your curiosity, right? It's just going, I really want to know this, and I'm just going to keep asking people and ping-ponging my way, toward the answer. And I think a lot more people have the ability to do that than they probably think. I mean, kind of at its core, the great thing about journalism is that anyone can do it. There are people who have experience doing it, and so they've learned how to do it well. But like, I have to remind myself of that sometimes, because I'll be going into a story and thinking like, oh, how do I do this the right way? And it's like, well, sometimes the answer is the most obvious thing, which is just call up that person and ask the questions you have. And if they don't answer you, try to figure out why they might not, or go ask another person. Like there's a certain part of it that's basic, that is what makes it so great, which is just kind of like barreling your way toward the answer, the same way that you keep, if you're on the phone with your cable company and they're not giving you the answer you want, you keep demanding to talk to someone else until you get it. Like it's sort of, there's something sort of fundamental about it that is great. And I think, like I said, more people can probably do than they realize. But yeah, I would just again say, like, not for freelancers, like not to be too hard on yourself, because that kind of work I do think is a lot harder to do when you're working on your own. I mean, that's just more challenging for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
like what you said about reading a lot too, because Barton Gellman, who writes for The Atlantic, he did that
mhm.
piece about so for people who may not have read it, that Atlantic piece, it kind of went viral. There's a lot of conversation about it, and it was about what would happen if Trump didn't concede.
Right.
Lo and behold,
Hypothetically speaking, yeah.
yeah. So it was interesting, because when I listened to an episode of Pod Save America, and they were like, yeah, that piece was over-reported. And I was like, well, was it though? Because it's exactly what's happening. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. But basically, I took that piece and I was like, hey, I'm going to make that. What would happen if that were in Tennessee? And that was that really long, like 2,500 word piece I did for the Tennessee Lookout, which I guess was sort of an investigation. It wasn't necessarily investigative in like, did this person really do this crime or not? It's not that kind of story, but it was a sort of long form story. And I did exactly what you said. I found something that was inspiring to me, and then I decided to make it local. I mean, that's being a bit reductive of my own work. Like, of course, it's more complicated than that, but
sure, but that you can get a lot of ideas by thinking of it. I mean, we always joke, people with some of my coworkers, I always joke about like, how can we localize this? Because you do see bad versions of that, but there are plenty of really good versions of that. Like a lot of national stories are also local stories.
Mhm.
And a lot of local stories should be national stories. So like, there's nothing, yeah, I think all of us can be guilty sometimes of thinking that a local story means it's like a smaller story,
Mhm.
but that's not true at all. Like, in fact, a lot of national stories are just local stories that got a lot of attention. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's a great way to come up with, it may not be the thing that gives you an easy story to do, but it's a great way to come up with ideas or questions you want to ask. You read a story at the national level and you go, that makes me wonder this about what's going on in my town or whatever,
Agreed. And I think a lot of local stories, I talk a lot about trying to find, or one thing that writers, at least they ask me about, is like, well, how do I come up with enough stories to pitch? And I'm like, well, everything that you read has either a bigger version or a smaller version. Like, you can always take local stories and make them national, or vice versa. Like, any local story that you do is usually emblematic of something that's going on around the country. Like George Floyd, that happened in a very, obviously he was murdered in his own community, but it became an international story because it was representative of an overarching problem. So I would encourage writers to think about that a lot, because if it's happening in your town, it's probably happening in other towns too. Or the converse could be true. It's really weird and it's not happening anywhere else, but still that's interesting to readers. So
Right. Either way, that makes it potentially a really interesting story. So
the last question I had is if you have any advice for writers who do want to be on staff, because on my platform, if I'm being honest, we do kind of like thumbs down, like trying to get on staff. I'm like, oh no, that'll never happen. Don't put your time and energy into it. But like, obviously you're living proof that that's not true, at least all the time. So I just wanted to, I don't know, hear your thoughts on that. If you think that,
yeah.
if it's doable.
Well, I mean, I get what you mean about not trying to like about sort of discouraging that as a thought, because there are unfortunately like fewer and fewer jobs of it out there, and more people who want them. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if, just to be honest, I don't know if I don't want to bullshit you. I don't know if I have a great answer to that, other than I do think that if you freelance for someone, you know, on a regular basis, like, you are freelancing is auditioning in some sense. I mean, the cool thing about journalism is that it is one of those industries where you get the chance to just try out the thing that you are theoretically wanting to do for a job. Like, so you're freelancing for if you freelance for one publication often, you know, and from experience, I mean, people that are regular contributors to places, when a job opens up, or even when a job isn't open, like, those people's names come up in conversation of like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could hire that person, or what, you know, because the people making those decisions have seen their work over and over again. They've seen them be reliable. They've seen them be, you know, all those things. So it's not like some brilliant insight, but I do think that developing relationships with editors and being someone, you know, the thing when I was freelancing, when I was like fully freelancing, the thing I always thought of is just like, how can I be the person that makes this person's job easier? And that, not that always says yes in the sense that you should like do anything and everything, but like when they need something, like you're kind of someone they know they can probably throw it to. And I don't want that to be taken the wrong way. Like, you should stand up for yourself. You should ask for more money if you can. You should do all those things. I just mean, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of the editors that you're probably freelancing for have a lot of work that is stacking up. They have a lot of stories that they need to have covered. They probably are short-staffed. And so if you're the person if you're on the short list of people they know they can rely on outside the building, there's no reason that won't be a factor when there is a job. And if you apply for it, like, they've seen your work, they know. So, I mean, that's the main thing I know. I mean, you know, I've applied for jobs that I haven't gotten before too. So it's not like, I mean, their jobs are hard to get. Like, every job that comes open, you just know there's going to be like a ton of people applying for it, because there are a lot of writers who either have been laid off and are trying to get jobs, or a lot of people who are freelancers who want a full-time job, or all this stuff. So, I mean, yeah, it's tough. I don't know. I hope that's somewhat helpful, but that's the best thought I have, because it is a tricky deal.
That is a good thought. And I mean, you know, I had a meeting with the editor of the Tennessee Lookout a few weeks ago, and she was like, yeah, I was thinking about adding on another full-time staff position. And I didn't say anything at the time because I don't have the bandwidth, nor do I want to be like full-time. I've really grown to like being my own sort of agent, even though I make a lot of mistakes and it's not always easy. I kind of like doing my own thing, but I thought in the back of my head in that moment, I was like, oh, well, if I wanted to be full-time, that would make sense for me to say something to her about it right now, because I've worked with this publication for several years now and done some work that I'm proud of with them. So I kind of had that thought at that time, even though that wasn't the opportunity for me, I could kind of see how that would happen and how that would work.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense if you're looking for if you're evaluating people who have applied for a job and there's a person who you've seen their work consistently and you've worked closely with them, like that's great. That's going to help.
Yeah. It kind of, in some ways, like, it sucks that it is that way, but boy, it sure is nice if it's you.
Oh yeah, I mean there are flaws with that too, because that is also directly connected to, you can see how, we were talking about the lack of diversity in newsrooms. You can see how if a paper has a freelance pool that's overwhelmingly white, and those are the people they draw from when they hire, I mean, these are self-fulfilling things, and so there are cycles that have to be broken. And but I guess it's tough. So like, the conversations we're having at the paper about how we can diversify the paper, how we can make sure that when we do have jobs to hire, that they're open to a wider pool of people, and include more people of color. Those are all those conversations. But yeah, if I'm speaking to like just one individual freelancer and I'm like, how can you get a job? The only way I know how is just like become very familiar to the people who hire the people. Like, I don't know how else seems like that's the best. So yeah, it's tricky. But, and yeah, you definitely won't be the only person doing that. So I don't know. It's hard. It's a really hard time. And I don't know when that's gonna change, if it does, but
Yeah, it's on some level, it's like we can talk all day about how we wish things were, and I do like talking about how I wish things were and how things could be better. But if you want to win, you kind of have to play the game the way that it is right now. And even if that starts with a Twitter DM to an editor that followed you, like, you never know where that could lead. So it does suck, but I do try to be. I guess I would say that I'm a pragmatist. Is that how you say that word? Pragmatist? I'm pragmatic because, as much as I wish that things were better, I also have to pay my bills right now. So that's something I talk a lot about with writers. It's like, man, I sure wish that things were better for you and for me. But at the same time, like, we have to win the game that we're currently in. And that involves, networking and building connections. And if that's the worst that you have to do, like,
well, not the thing for me is, I always think about like the way I got my job and the way I've gotten some freelance work, or the way I've gotten to know it's the same way I do my job, which is calling people up or reaching out to people out of the blue and saying, hey, can we talk about this? I mean, it's basically like reporting anyway. So if you think of it like that, I mean, oh, you're trying to get to know some editors at a publication that you hope to pitch. I mean, that's not much different than when you're your first day reporting a story and you're just cold calling people and saying, can we talk about this? I'm working on a story about this and I need to know more about, I mean, it's sort of the same thing, And I think that, I mean, if it's like, if you can't manage to get in touch with an editor at a place, that doesn't speak too well for your ability to report a story out for them anyway. So they're probably going to, so it's like, it's kind of all the same sort of muscle,
right.
I think.
I'm holding him captive because that's the last question I had for you. And it'd be much easier just to grab him and hold him. Is there anything that I didn't ask you? Look at I mean, clearly I'm approaching this. It's funny because when I do these interviews, like, I'm still doing it as a reporter. And this is the last question that I always ask, which is,
I always
did I
do.
forget?
That's a good question. I don't think so. It's good to talk though, and I appreciate you reaching out about it. I hope it's been helpful. I feel, everyone's sort of way into this kind of work can be different. So
I feel
I
like
sometimes like my
person.
what's that?
Oh, I just said I feel like it is different for every single person. I don't think I've ever talked to anyone and they had, like, two people had similar or the same stories. It just doesn't really happen.
Yeah. And things are changing pretty quickly too. So like, that's the tricky thing about it too. Like, in some ways there are a lot more opportunities for people to be independent journalists, but you also have to figure out a way to make money doing that, which is, so like,
It's
I
not.
don't know. No, it's hard. And yeah, I have a lot of respect for people who are full-time freelancers, because that's that's a tough gig, just logistically, just to keep all those balls in the air at the same time. So yeah,
Hey,
my
I look forward
respect goes.
to my premature gray hair. I mean, that's what it amounts to. It's just like, it just makes you, and it's funny because at the end of the day, I make jokes about like, oh, like it's hard, and it is hard, and it does make me anxious. But just like I told you, even when there was a wisp of a full-time opportunity, I'm at the end of the day, like I'm really grateful to be doing what I'm doing. And sometimes I look back and I'm like, man, I have no idea how I managed to scrape together enough work to pay my bills. Um, excuse you, but I'm really grateful. I mean, clearly he's treated terribly in this household. Um, have you ever seen a clingier man? Because I have not. He's so clingy. But yeah, I'm just really grateful that I get to be full-time freelance, and I look at staff reporters like yourself who do great work, and I'm like, man, I love what you do, but I sure do like being freelance. I just like it.
Yeah, no, I can see why you would. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah, it's you get to kind of pursue whatever you want, and if you can make it work, then I get it for sure.
Yeah, it's it's not always easy, and I do fuck up all the time, but I try. I try my hardest. I mean, this is a whole other topic of conversation, but some of my income is not journalism either. It's copywriting. So when
Mhm.
people ask me what I do, I'm like, oh, I'm a writer, versus saying, oh, I'm a journalist, because journalism is not the only thing that I do. It's probably the bulk of what I do, especially lately. Excuse you, bitey boy. But I mean, I do a couple of different things to make ends meet.
Mhm.
So if you ever want to talk about copywriting, you let me know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no, yeah. Listen, I know it's that way for a lot of people. You gotta piece together what you can and find the thing that pays you enough to let you pursue the other stuff that you are passionate about. So yeah, I mean, makes total sense.
Just in the same way, like a lot of my copywriting work has come through people I've networked with, and I just got a new client, and it was because I asked my previous, well, they're still my client, but I asked my current client to introduce me to them. So it's same
Hmm.
same sort of rules. It's like, hey man, can I get an introduction? We did a guest post for them. I would love to meet them. And they introduced me, and now they're giving me work. So it's kind of similar to that same
Yeah,
idea. It's like reaching out. You never know. You might as well try. Just ask.
for
So,
sure.
and they paid their invoice in 15 minutes. So hell
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, that's one you got to keep then for sure.
for sure. Well, listen, I will let you go, but I'm very appreciative of your time. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, thanks for wanting to chat with me. I appreciate it too.
Of course, as usual, I'm going to send this to my fabulous transcriber, Nicole, and once she has the Q&A text ready, I'll post it, and I'll send you the link beforehand, and we'll coordinate.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephen. I hope you have
Yeah,
a good day.
you too. Good talking to you. All right.
Bye.